Old World, Florida. Dr. Narco Longo.
Brought to you by the Florida Department of Magic. Welcome to Florida, baby.
Florida is the original Garden of Eden.
Florida has the highest concentration of freshwater springs in the world.
Florida oranges are the golden apples of mythology. A race of giant men once roamed this peninsula. The Smithsonian can suck my balls. Old World, Florida.
Yo, what's up, everyone? Happy Saturday. It's January 31st. I'm coming to you live from the Dancing Elephant Bookstore. And there we go, in our nice little place. And welcome to the casting couch. Have a seat. What was your name? Where are you from again? It doesn't matter. Not important. So we're going to be talking about William Shakespeare tonight. Okay. Now, lots of people like William Shakespeare. Lots of people revere his work and, give him all the credit that's due. But not many people talk about what I think is the most interesting side of Shakespeare. The fact that he was an avid astrologer. Okay. The fact that he, or at least used astrology in his plays. Okay, we don't know if he was an astronomer per se, but he seems to have been well versed in astrology, just in the explicit content of the plays. Lots of references to astrological events, eclipses, Mars or Venus rising or setting, over a battlefield or a wedding, things like that. But then beyond that, William Shakespeare actually using astrology to craft his characters. That's what we're really going to be digging into tonight. And we're going to be building on the work of a great researcher. Her name is Priscilla Costello. Priscilla Costello is an author. And I don't know where she's from originally, but she is a Florida legend. Okay. So she spends, I guess, part of her time in Palm Beach County. My brother and I have been trying to get a hold of her for a long time. Haven't had any luck yet, but we sell her book sometimes in our bookstore when we can get it. And yeah, that's the gist of tonight. William Shakespeare, astrology, but also his true identity. Now, that's going to come up because Priscilla Costello herself is, I don't know what's the word. She is of the opinion that William Shakespeare was somebody else. Okay? We're going to get into all that. But before we do, let's say what up to Merlin. How you doing, man?
What up, man? I'm good. Hope you are. Hope you're feeling good. Hope the chat's feeling good. Like you were alluding to, tonight's episode is going to be a good one because a knowledge of astrology can really enhance your Shakespeare reading or enjoying experience big time because every play, there are so many different allusions to the stars. And if you really know your stuff, it just adds that extra level of depth that Shakespeare, like you said, was well familiar with. And if you're an audience of the casting couch, then now you will be familiar with. So it's going to be a good one tonight, guys.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I'm already seeing lots of good comments. I know lots of you guys are clued into the whole Pallas Athena rabbit hole. Edward de Vere, Francis Bacon. Those are going to be two big names we're going to be talking about a lot. Those are the most commonly proposed alternative identities for Christopher Columbus. Sorry, man. I've had my nose stuck in too much Columbus stuff recently. Okay. William Shakespeare. Freudian slip there. Let's see. All right. Let's say what up to everyone before we get started in the chat. Guys, drop an orange or a tangerine or something orange in the chat if you want us to say hi. And we'll try and shout everyone out. Yeah, already seeing some good comments, like I said. Here, this one. Here we go. This is a good one just to start off with. Start off with the name, right? That's the best place to start with anything. I always try to start off that way. Start off with the name. It'll give you the essence of the thing, right? Shakespeare, Karl Karsnark, with a comment here, said Shakespeare equals shake plus spear, a reference to Pallas Athena, where Pallas equals spear shaker in Greek. True. Okay. That's true. We're not going to be focusing on that too much, but why don't we start off with it? Okay. William Shakespeare, the real William Shakespeare. When I say real, okay, the attributed William Shakespeare, okay, the William Shakespeare born around 1564, April of 1564, okay, allegedly from Stratford upon Avon in the UK. Now, that guy, there's a lot of evidence that he wasn't the real author, or at the very least, not the only author. Okay. He might have been a player. He might have been a member of a kind of secret society, a guild, right? Like a group who was working, relentlessly to pump out this high grade material. It would make sense that you had a lot of geniuses getting together to do it. It would be a lot easier. That being said, there are others who still doubt William Shakespeare's identity, who say, no, it was still one guy, but it was either Edward de Vere or Francis Bacon. So William Shakespeare is said to have been born 1564. Edward de Vere said to have been born 1550. Francis Bacon, 1561. So Shakespeare and Bacon are pretty dang close. De Vere is about 10 years, farther off, but, not outside the realm of possibility, right? That you could pass as someone, right? We hear stories about Bill Hicks and Alex Jones and
Yeah.
what are they, like 10 years apart? This could be something like that. Okay. But William Shakespeare, just starting off with the name Shakespeare. I don't think anyone doubts that guy, William Shakespeare, that his name was William Shakespeare. But guys, when he wrote his name, when he signed his own name, this William Shakespeare guy, he signed it differently each time that we have it on record. And I think at least one of them, if not two of his confirmed signatures, say Shack Spur. Shack Spur. So some people think the William Shakespeare was not even fully literate or that good of a writer. Well, some people are going off his signature when they say that. But there's others who say this man was not educated enough. This man didn't know the ins and the outs of court life, the European court, the English court, let alone the Italian court. Okay, the inner operations of how these things happened are all necessary for the authorship of Shakespeare. You need to know, Shakespeare is writing from within the royal court. Or at least that's what a lot of experts have came away saying is the true William Shakespeare, or the William Shakespeare that is, accredited with all this work. He may not have been educated enough to have pulled this off. It would have been impressive to say the least. Okay. Whereas someone like de Vere or Bacon, and we're going to introduce you to them too, they spent plenty of time in court, in the royal court, hearing the queen speak, hearing different people, raising concerns, in front of the court and the different languages necessary to kind of know what's going on. Bacon and De Vere were equipped to know that stuff. Highly, highly educated. Geniuses, statesmen, right? Shakespeare, on the other hand, kind of almost like the equivalent of like a Los Angeles kind of guy, like a Hollywood type of guy, maybe a little bit, not necessarily known for his genius, but more his connections. He knows the ins and the outs of kind of the theater, company, backstage, right? All that, the operation of a play. You want to?
Oh, I mean,
Marlon?
It's just so interesting how, this was set up 400 years ago when these works were first thrust into the public zeitgeist. And here we are, centuries later, and they're still so relevant. And I know in Manly P. Hall's work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, he asserts that there was no William Shakespeare. I don't think he comes out decisively on whether it's Francis Bacon or who's the other guy? I'm sorry, Eric DeVay? Not Eric DeVay.
De Vere.
De Vere, Edward De Vere. That's right, De Vere. But he says that there was no Shakespeare for sure. So,
yeah,
it's just so weird how and again, they're lying about things as they're happening today, right? So they've had 400 years to work on this narrative of who and what Shakespeare is, and what we're introduced to. At least it's really weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So William Shakespeare. Apparently, there was a guy with the real name William Shakespeare, and he was involved in the theater industry, acting, all that. Whether they found him because he had the perfect name, just close enough to where he could take credit for all this stuff they were working on. Essentially, can you go back to Bacon?
Yeah, sure.
So that's Francis Bacon and Edward De Vere. The two most likely candidates, right? Alternatives for Shakespeare. Let's talk about the name since we're on that for a little. Shakespeare, the Pallas Athena, that's true. Okay. Pallas Athena, it's a version of the goddess Athena who is particularly geared towards wisdom and writers. Okay. People who think and reason and write and, have to be persuasive, right? That is Pallas Athena holding her spear, often with a helmet that is kind of, pulled off her head. Her visor's back on her helmet, or her helmet's halfway off so that she can see. And it's said that she would shake her spear, or that her statues in ancient Greece of Athena would have a spear, and they would often seem like they were being shaken, right? Or it would be like an optical illusion. People would think they saw Athena shake her spear. Some people would say it looked like that in the rain, or when water would, drip down, whatever, that the spear would glimmer, right? Or seem to vibrate. But essentially, the thought was that, do you have a picture of Pallas Athena? Could you pull that up?
Yeah, give me one second.
Just Google search it.
Yeah.
Pallas Athena. Thanks. So Athena, having her spear, would shake it, maybe some people would say like wagging a finger, like, hey, come on, use common sense, use your reason, or kind of admonishing someone, or right, trying to correct someone's behavior, kind of like a judge, kind of banging their thing.
Yeah.
So Athena with her spear would shake her spear. Okay. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Well, there was a group of geniuses, okay, who would get together And one of their kind of code names that the group would be known by was the Knights of Pallas Athena, or the Spear Shakers. Okay. The Knights of the Pallas Athena. Now, that group would get together, and ultimately, this all goes back to Queen Elizabeth the First. Okay. Queen Elizabeth the First started, in motion what would become the King James Version Bible. Okay. She was dead before it came out. They were still working on it. They had a lot more work to do. So it got switched over to King James's supervision, right? And some people will say, "Oh, King James started that himself. It had nothing to do with Queen Elizabeth." Yes and no. The body of work that was getting done under Queen Elizabeth got carried on. But yes, King James did call for his own, his own
version of the Bible.
Yeah. So it ends up getting called King James. We almost got a Queen Elizabeth Bible, which would have been really cool. Now, Queen Elizabeth, she had astrologers. She had John Dee working for her. Okay. The famous John Dee, infamous John Dee, right? Who was a ceremonial magician, a master astrologer, mathematician, spoke a couple languages. And like I said, he practiced ceremonial magic, and he would speak to angels and demons. Yeah, so he was working for Queen Elizabeth, and he, she was interested in astrology. He got her more interested in astrology. Now, allegedly, Queen Elizabeth is remembered. Can we look at Queen Elizabeth too?
Yeah,
please?
for sure.
Queen Elizabeth is remembered as the Virgin Queen because she didn't have a husband, and she didn't have any legitimate children or recognized children. Now, what's crazy is a lot of people think, not that many, but a lot. Some people think that she did have a son, and this son was secretly Francis Bacon. And that Francis Bacon was raised by another family, okay, in disguise, right, as someone else, as Francis Bacon, but he was really Queen Elizabeth's bastard child. And I believe Robert Dudley, is that the guy?
Was it the father?
Yeah. Queen Elizabeth Dudley, something. Yeah, Robert Dudley. Yes, Robert Dudley may have been the father. This was apparently the closest man to Queen Elizabeth. If she did have a kid with anyone or a secret romance, it was him. Now, from that, potentially, Francis Bacon was born. Queen Elizabeth had had so many, assassination orders put on her as an adult and as a kid. Family members being executed, having to hide, being, shuffled around from one family member to the next. Scary, right? She didn't want that for her kids, whether she had them or not, right? She didn't want them. That was a motivation for her to be so selective in finding a husband and not, just having kids for the sake of it. But if she did have a son from a secret romance with Mr. Dudley, she, according to this, narrative, according to this theory, chose to keep him far away, not too far, but outside of the royal, family, outside of the whole Game of Thrones, right? She wanted her kid to be completely safe. And this kid may have been Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, who then also would have been William Shakespeare. Now, hang on, that might seem like a lot of leaps, okay? But there's a lot to it. Now, some people say Bacon had nothing to do with Shakespeare at all, that it was all a man by the name of De Vere, okay? Edward de Vere. 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. But let's talk about Shakespeare for a sec, too. William Shakespeare is known for a couple things, okay? Kind of revolutionizing English, but also a lot of dirty jokes, dick jokes. William Shakespeare is a lot cooler when you recognize that he was more like the South Park of his day than the Shakespeare of his day, or the Downton Abbey of his day, or the, it was not the, what can we compare it to? It wasn't the Finnegan's Wake of its day. It wasn't the, it wasn't the most heady, most wordy, like that. William Shakespeare had a raunchiness to it. Okay. It was almost like rap music or punk rock a little bit. It may seem like the, very refined and high society now, but in those days, some of those plays, depending on who was in power, depending who was the local, lord or king at the time, you could get your head cut off for a lot of the stuff in those plays. Not just the political content, right? But also some of the jokes and some of the lewdness, okay? William Shakespeare's full of dick jokes. And when you realize it was like the South Park of its day, it becomes a lot more interesting, funny, easier to read, not grueling when you realize it's packed with jokes, packed with, dirty humor, gallows humor, Yeah. It's hilarious. So William Shakespeare, let's look back at the name real quick. Okay. Is there another meaning that we can find in William Shakespeare? Well, Willie is a sexual innuendo, or it's a nickname for the penis. Willie. Shakespeare. Okay. Man, how many men in America are just wasting their life shaking their spears all day, right? Don't let your mom catch you in your room shaking your spear, okay? Right? Shakespeare. That's an innuendo in itself, to shake the spear. That might seem like no, you just have a dirty mind, No, read some Shakespeare. Go ask the world's least horny Shakespeare expert. They'll tell you it's packed with dick jokes and sexual innuendo. There's whole books that have been written. You want to search that real quick? William Shakespeare sexual innuendo book, something like that.
Let's take a look. Shakespeare's best dirty lines and innuendo. I mean, there's
go to images.
Yeah, let's take a look.
Yeah.
The sweet silvery sayings of Shakespeare on the softer sex. I mean, not so much the lewd stuff, but how he wrote about women. But you're totally right in that there is a lot of lewdness to Shakespeare. It's meant to have something for everybody. Like gallows humor is a perfect way to say it. And like you were mentioning earlier, Shakespeare really took paradigms and flipped them on their head. It's a lot of what he was known for. It's very cool stuff. And I love how you pointed out too, how Queen Elizabeth had her own court astrologer, and that's what's so cool, guys, right? Like, what are we doing here every week learning astrology? You can take it far. Every single great, Muslim caliphate, kings and queens throughout the ages, they all had their personal astrologers, and that's not an accident. Every truther has heard of the banker's, watch, his wristwatch with the planets on it, right?
JP
So
Morgan.
JP Morgan's wristwatch, right? Oh, the
Pocket
infamous
watch.
pocket watch. Thank you.
Pocket watch, yeah.
So, it's like they take this stuff very seriously, and you could take it far. There's a lot of utility to astrology, and just the fact that people like Queen Elizabeth had court astrologers, Muslim caliphates having court astrologers completely lends credence to that. So let's see. Shakespeare sex, contemporary. Oh gosh, this is what talk about. So, spoiler alert for the chat. I have an English lit degree, and I wrote my thesis on Shakespeare. And my goodness, modern academia is plagued with something called queer theory, where they try to make every character gay. Like, it's like, oh, why did this character do that? Because he's gay. Why did he do that? Because he's gay. And they rewrite everything in this, dude. And I mean, it is a plague on the institutions of today. It's actually crazy.
Yeah. Amen. So let's see where to start. Well, okay, here. Let's sum up the Shakespeare story real quick before we move away from it.
Sure.
William Shakespeare. Let's say William Shakespeare was William Shakespeare. Okay, he wrote his plays, became super influential, and you don't have to worry about it at all. All right, that's good enough for some people. It's not good enough for me. I've seen enough to convince me that he was someone else, if not a committee or like a council, secret society of people. So, like I was saying, Francis Bacon, the theory that Queen Elizabeth may have had a illegitimate child, a secret child, with Mr. Dudley, Robert Dudley, and that child was Francis Bacon, who was raised in secret and provided one of the best educations in the world, okay, because his mom was the queen. So he's protected from the battles and the disagreements and revenge of like royal life, the Game of Thrones. But he's also getting the benefit of having a royal education, in secret, in private. So this would have made Francis Bacon quite literally the most educated man in Europe, potentially. If this theory is true. But regardless of whether the theory is true, he was extremely well educated. Now, how do we get to Shakespeare and why writing? And what are the chances that this illegitimate kid becomes the greatest, writer of all time, right? The chances are pretty slim of that, just to be honest. Well, when you understand that his mom, Queen Elizabeth, wanted to use the English language to rule the world. And Queen Elizabeth, her Kabbalistic, angel in conversation with angels and demons on the regular, learning Enochian language, fusing angelic language into the English language, fusing the English angelic alphabet into the English alphabet. That guy is giving Queen Elizabeth her daily advice, okay? Selecting the date for her coronation, I believe, too. I think that's true. Things like that, okay? That Queen Elizabeth had a dream, a vision. I don't know if she came up with it herself, but she embraced it 1000%. That the English language, not the English military might, would take over the world. English dominating just through language. They studied Phoenician because they knew they realized that's what the Phoenicians did in part. They were also aware of what the French had done. I don't know, 200 years or less prior to this, the French had standardized their language. And I don't know the timeline on that, but it was before the English did so. And this led to the French becoming known as the poetic standard of Europe, is something, if it does something sound like French, then it's poetic, then it's beautiful, right? Then it's poetically capable. English was not thought of like that. English was a hodgepodge of a bunch of different crap. Okay. You had Scottish people in one part, Scottish Gaelic, you had Irish on one side, you had Danish taking over England for large parts of time, you had Norwegian, you had and Dutch. English is, I guess, closest to Dutch, they say. Frisian, right? Something in there. And then also what was really being spoken was French in England at the time. So the nobility leading up to Elizabeth's day all spoke French. All those Henrys in William Shakespeare, most of the kings and the queens in Shakespeare's histories are speaking French. Okay. And it's written in English, but they were speaking French in real life. Now, understanding that Francis Bacon's potential mom, okay, let's just put the alleged, child to the side, right? We don't have to say he's her bastard to make this story work. Let's just put that part to the side. Maybe Francis Bacon just was really dedicated to Queen Elizabeth and believed in what England was capable of and believed in this mission and bought in 100%. Well, Elizabeth envisioned the English language taking over the world, and John Dee was helping her doing it and giving her great ideas. Francis Bacon essentially picks up where John Dee left off. And whether or not he's Queen Elizabeth's son, that is true, as he largely picked up John Dee's work and continued much of what John Dee was kind of getting done. One of those projects and part of the whole plan to take over the world with the English language, like I said, was first to standardize it. And the first step to standardize the English language was to print the Bible, a superior Bible translation, in a new English, a new standardized English. And once that was, disseminated across England, then you wouldn't have this regional hodgepodge of language. You'd go, essentially, England's not that big, okay? It's tiny. And you'd go from one part of England to, an hour down the street, or one day's horse ride, and they're speaking a whole nother language. How can you get anything done like that? So they noticed that the French had done this through poetry. They got the whole country on the same page by standardizing the language. So they start doing this with the Bible under Queen Elizabeth's direction, or her, her orders. And John Dee's involved. You got all the greatest geniuses in England: bards, poets, Kabbalists, Hebrew translators, Aramaic, Greek translators. Every angle you can look at the Bible, they had the greatest genius in either England or Europe there at the Knights of the Round Table, hashing all this stuff out. And what did we get out of that? We got this committee that put together the King James Version Bible. Francis Bacon is known to have had at least some, Francis Bacon involvement with KJV Bible. I think he was so people say it's a theory. I don't know if it's a theory, okay? I don't know this.
Let's run with it.
Yeah, so
Cold,
I'm trying to confirm. I'm not going to say it's cold hard fact,
I'm
because I don't know the history But essentially, Francis Bacon is widely believed, let's just say it like that, to have been involved in the drafting or the final cut, the final edition, or the initial drafting of what would become the King James Version Bible. Now, if that's true, we have Francis Bacon being involved in the King James Version Bible. Okay. Now, what happens when you get all those greatest geniuses in one room and they're stuck within the confines of the Bible, right? All these great geniuses, they're putting all this work into making the English Bible the best. But they're also pretty creative guys, and they're riffing. They're like, what if we could put a dick joke in there? What if we could do this? What if this or that? So they start thinking about what else can they do with this recipe, these ingredients outside of the Bible. Now, William Shakespeare, and especially, the histories are, they're kind of true stories or sometimes timeless stories or historical, right? Well, what if I told you beyond that, it's essentially fan fiction on the Bible? Not in the sense of the content, but in the sense of the group of people who were forced to stay true to the canon of the Bible, then were let loose and were given liberty to do whatever the heck they wanted. Also kind of within some parameters, but not true to just one material, right? Not just one text or one source. So what am I saying? The King James Version Bible was put together, and as much as they're having fun, ironing out the Kabbalah and the numerology necessary to make the original Hebrew, numerology run true in the English Bible too, for the English Bible, English translation, not just to be faithful in the translation, but to be faithful to the original Kabbalah and numerology in the Old Testament. They put in that effort in the King James Version Bible. But when you get all those people together, then they start wanting to work on other ideas that are not just the Bible. And William Shakespeare, according to this theory, was the outlet, the vessel, the vehicle through which they were able to riff and just start having fun, essentially. And a lot of those would get made into plays, and that was a big part of it too. And I should say this. I think a lot of people look at this from the wrong angle. I've heard it explained that, Francis Bacon or De Vere, and we're going to talk about De Vere too. We've only talked about Bacon, so much, really, so far. People explain it, I think, in the wrong way. They say, well, writing these plays back then was seen as low class. It was almost like being a rapper, like I was saying earlier. It was like raunchy and it was like South Park, Can you really run for governor or run for president if you're writing dirty TV shows on the side? Not really, right? Well, people try to explain that Francis Bacon couldn't afford people knowing that he was really writing this stuff. It would ruin his reputation. Or same with De Vere. It would ruin their reputations if people found out they were the ones writing this kind of low, dirty stuff. And it was seen as also a waste of time. It's not necessarily that people didn't respect it. A lot of people just saw it as vain, idle, very, something that someone, a statesman, a mathematician wouldn't waste time doing, right? Now that's what a lot of people argue. I don't know if that's the best way to look at it. It's certainly true, the aspect of being a playwright was kind of like being, like the writer of South Park, or almost like a rapper, back then. People would say, "Oh, you're doing it for the fame or the credit or the money or the girls or whatever." Almost like a circus too. Sometimes theaters would come into town like a circus, and they just didn't have the best reputation. But okay, I think the better explanation is that Queen Elizabeth wanted to use English to take over the world. She did that with the Bible. She got all the greatest geniuses in the world to help do that with the Bible. But then they wanted to keep working. They wanted to keep having fun. And Shakespeare is how they did that. They got all these new ways to come up with poems, stories, sometimes staying true to the history, or true-ish, right? Using historical characters like all the King Henrys, King Richard, you name it, you name it. Real princes, too. But, or at least often inspired by real people, right? Or sometimes directly named characters named after real people from history. But outside of that, they can still come up with all the dialogue. They can still come up with all the, it's way different than working on the Bible, where you've got to stay true to what's in the text. Shakespeare was like, just let it rip, whatever comes to mind, whatever works, whatever's funny. No constraints, really. Other than they tended to glorify Shakespeare's plays, the histories tended to glorify Queen Elizabeth, or whoever was in power at the time, would glorify their ancestors. Their side of the family would be often depicted in a better light. So politics is not necessarily a political stance. It's more like if George Bush was president and the Bush family went back 500 years in America or whatever, or in World War II or whatever they were up to, I don't know. They're going to get painted positively because the show's coming out, in their lifetime, whatever.
How good would it be to see a play about Jeb Bush making guacamole, or whatever it is Jeb Bush does on a daily basis?
No, he makes guacamole all right. He makes guacamole noises. Okay, we'll say that.
Yeah, it's real interesting though. Because prior to this time, most books are written in Latin. So it is like Shakespeare and then the Bible being rewritten in English, really thrust, like you were saying, the English language into the worldwide domain. It was the reason for people to not read Latin, because Latin was so good, because you could be German, French, English, Italian, whatever, Arabic. You knew Latin, you could read the same books, you could talk about the same things. So, these new works really helped thrust the English language into the worldwide domain.
Yeah. This commenter says Marlowe. Yeah, Marlowe's also what's the word? It's possible
contender.
Yeah, possible contender. But yeah. This is ultimately what I think. Okay, I think it was a group. It was a secret society. It was a lot of the same people involved in the King James Version Bible, being probably headed by Bacon or De Vere or Marlowe. Okay. There's another name. There's another one who is commonly, proposed. There's a fourth name. I'll know when I see it. But yeah.
Yeah, I think a group makes the most sense because it was a group who worked in the KJV, and it's not just one person doing all this work. There's just
Mhm.
no way. Some claim, oh yeah, it's possible.
Right.
I don't buy that.
And the real William Shakespeare, it's more likely that the real William Shakespeare would be involved in some way with that group rather than, having this one friend that he's willing to take all the credit for, and never tell about it.
Hmm.
It's much more likely that he was part of a secret society or a group that he had more support behind him than just playing kind of a trick on the whole world for one friend's sake. Um, but all right, so yeah, Marlowe's a contender, but and I wish I knew more of the De Vere evidence, okay? Because I don't. I have, I think studied more of the Bacon side of things. But I guess we'll let Priscilla Costello maybe do some explaining. I think she talks about De Vere a little bit in this one, but we're going to learn about astrology. Now, it's much more likely that Bacon or, some other friend of John Dee's would have been encoding the Shakespeare or, this astrology into Shakespeare. Did William Shakespeare know much about astrology? I don't know. Probably not, you know. Um, but here, let's watch this Priscilla Costello video, and then we're going to kind of react to what she says a little.
Sounds good.
And this is from Watkins Bookstore in England. I think they're in London. I think. Watkins Bookstore, a very popular, historic, occult, bookstore in England, and they sell one of our books there, if not two. But all right, so we're gonna watch Shakespeare and Astrology by Priscilla Costello from the Watkins Books YouTube channel, and for a long time I've wanted to collab with her or get an interview or something, but it's hard to get a hold of her. So, and we sell her books here. So I'm trying to support, and I hope, maybe this is a form of support. I think you guys will see this. You'll find this interesting and go try to buy her book, seek her out, tell her Old World Florida sent you, something like that, if you get a hold of her. But let's get into it. This is from the beginning. I think the audio only comes through one speaker, so just be careful of that if you're using headphones. All right.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming.
Okay, one sec.
Sounds good on my end.
Cool.
No custom slider. Oh, there it is. Okay, sweet.
Is Thursday, June 6th, 2016, and I'm here at Watkins Bookstore in London, England, and it's just wonderful to be here. I fell into doing this book, and I don't know why I didn't do it sooner, because I spent over 30 years teaching Shakespeare's plays and over 30 years being a professional astrologer, and the two worlds were entirely separate. I was a teacher by day, and I was an astrologer by night. And sure, I noticed the references to the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, comets, eclipses, and there are a few other more obscure references that are part of the astrological vocabulary. I noticed those in the play, but I seriously did not get how profoundly significant and intrinsic to the plays are the astrological symbols. Now, that's going to sound strange to a modern audience because in our day, pretty much astrology has been marginalized. It's fallen out of favor with the rise of the scientific paradigm, the materialist, mechanist paradigm. But I think one of the reasons that we're still so drawn to Shakespeare's plays is he's writing out of a worldview that is a holistic worldview that sees connections between nature, humanity, and the cosmos. And that's exactly what the language of astrology does. It links nature, humanity, and the cosmos. So when I had time finally to begin to look much more deeply into it, I was really shocked. I was surprised. I was embarrassed that I had not actually picked up on the symbolism. And I want to say there's 3 ways in which you can discover how significant that symbolism is to Shakespeare's plays. And the first is he uses it for poetic or sort of more decorative references. I mean, it's much lovelier to say as
rules, commands, MCP servers, subagents, modes, hooks, tools. There's
Shut your bitch
one of the
ass up.
characters at the end of Love's Labour's Lost says, it's the French princess. If you know the play, you know, these 4 young men have said, we're not going to have anything to do with women for an entire year. And of course, immediately 4 lovely French princesses show up. And the French princesses basically show how foolish the young men's desires were, because they immediately break their promises. And at the end, they're unmasked as being suitors to each of the 4 princesses. And so the main French princess, says to King Ferdinand and his lords at the end of the play that they have to spend a year in a hermitage. But here's the way poetically that Shakespeare says this. There stay until the 12 celestial signs have brought about the annual reckoning. I mean, it's just a prettier way to say that than to say, wait for an entire year. So you do get kind of decorative, poetic or more artistic references to the sun, moon, stars, and so on. But that's kind of, and there's another one in Macbeth even, where Macbeth says, stars hide your fires, let not night see my black and deep desires. And that again is kind of a way of saying, I understand how terrible my intention is to murder the king, and I don't want anything to see that. I don't want the heavens to see that, because I know that this is going to damn me. But then there's another way in which I think that Shakespeare made use of this. And one of the questions that will come up, I think, in the course of this talk is the sources of Shakespeare's creativity. There's an inexhaustible creative source that seems to empower the plays, and again, I think accounts for their popularity over 400 years. This is very appropriate that we're here talking about Shakespeare, because it's, of course, the 400th anniversary of his passing, just in the month of April we just had. So for plays to have lasted that long and to be so popular now more than ever, I think, than they've been even in his own time, says something about this significance of what he's drawing on. Now, astrological symbolism is what's called archetypal in nature. And that means it's drawing on fundamental ideas that in their basic nature do not change over time. Their specific expression changes, but the fundamental idea doesn't. And I think that's part of what appeals to us in Shakespeare's plays. Okay, so we have the lovely poetic stuff, you know, the stars and the sun and the moon and so on. And then I think when Shakespeare was creating his characters, he naturally used the personality system that was very popular. In fact, it had been popular for 2,000 years before Shakespeare. It's called the temperament theory, or the theory of the humors. Is anybody familiar with that here? So, you know, there's 4 types, and each of those types is correlated with a particular planet. And it gets very elaborate because it's not only that the system works with a particular planet.
Can you hear that music?
Yep, coming through just fine.
Sounds good.
Yeah, good volume.
Thanks.
And a particular type, it works with the season of the year, it works with a season of a human being's life. And so we get the speech that Jake gives in Twelfth Night, I think it is, where he talks about the 7 ages of man. Well, they're exactly correlated with the 7 planets and the 7 stages of a human being's life. So when Shakespeare created his characters, and here's the amazing paradox about this, he creates the characters absolutely true to their type, but completely individualized, so that they are a specific expression of a universally recognized type. For instance, I bet you can guess which are the choleric types, because there's lots and lots of them in Shakespeare's plays. Choleric types are really useful because they're the angry people. They're the ones who stir up conflict. And if
She's saying choleric or choleric, by the way. Choleric, meaning like cholera, or like anger or bitterness or aggression, you know, agitation, hot-headed people, choleric.
Yep.
you don't have conflict in a play, you don't have any juice to keep the plot going. So you get a character like Tybalt, who is angry every single time he comes onto the stage during Romeo and Juliet. He's always looking to pick a fight. I hate hell as I hate Montagues as I hate hell on Montagues in the Omega line, but you get the idea. And even at the Capulets' party, which is a social occasion, it's ruled by Venus. It should not be a disrupted event. Tybalt recognizes that it's Romeo behind the mask, and he so wants to attack him at the party, and it takes all of old Capulet's strength to rein Tybalt in, who, of course, stomps off and says, "You haven't seen the last of me," and he creates trouble at the end of the play. Another really easily recognizable choleric type is Hotspur, if you know Hotspur in Henry IV, Part 1. And he's exactly that type. He's always angry, and he's, in fact, has an incredible scene where he attacks and demeans the wizard Glendower. And of course, Glendower is a magician. It would seem to be very foolish of Hotspur to attack a magician and tell him that he doesn't believe in him at all. But of course, this would have been easily recognized by Shakespeare's audience because hot and spur are two words that are associated with Mars, which is the planet that's associated with the choleric type. Mars rules everything that's hot and spicy, everything that is a sharp pointed instrument. So spurs, knives, swords, pointed objects are all ruled by Mars. So you name a character Hot Spur, and it's a dead giveaway to the audience that he's modeled on this particular type. So sometimes Shakespeare has direct references. He'll absolutely give it away. In The Winter's Tale, in the second half of the play, where it changes from the winter story into something that's a little more summery, the second part of the play takes place presumably in Bohemia, and you discover that the child of the king that you thought was dead isn't dead, and she's been raised by shepherds, and she's really beautiful, and the princess found her, and it's all wonderful. There's a festival, a kind of summer harvest festival going on, and in comes a character who identifies himself as being littered under Mercury. And what he's trying to tell everybody is he's a thief. And that would have been very easily recognized by Shakespeare's audience because Mercury had a number of different rulerships, a number of things that it was associated with. And one of those things was thievery, because mercurial types were thought to have very good hand-arm coordination and to be very quick. And so they could be quick in picking things up. And he is. He's very quick at picking up things as he goes around during the festival, and he's stealing everybody's things out of their pockets. He's basically a pickpocket. Then there's other plays. The horrible play, Titus Andronicus. Has anybody seen Titus Andronicus? Julie Taymor did a wonderful movie of that, starring Sir Anthony Hopkins as Titus Andronicus, but it's filled with horrors. It's the only play that Shakespeare did that appears to be modeled on what are called Senecan tragedies, which are just full of blood and gore. I mean, you have rape in that play, and you have the poor daughter of Titus has her tongue cut out and her hands cut off so that she can't identify her rapists. And at the end, Titus gets his vengeance by cutting up the rapist and putting it into a stew and serving it to the mother. So it's a really horrible play, but I've seen a wonderful version of it done at the Shakespeare Globe Theatre. At the very beginning, when Tamora, who is the captured queen of the Moors, comes in, and she has a lover who happens to be also a Moor. And the Moor says to her, "Venus may govern your desires where Saturn governs mine." And that's absolutely true to her type. She's a seductress, and she manages to convince the king that she's quite happy at having been captured and she'll marry him, but really she wants to plan revenge. And it is the Moor, Aaron the Moor, who plans the vengeance that comes on Titus. So he's definitely a Saturnian type. So you get the idea that the characters are very true to their type. And in each of the plays, you will find characters whose type suits that particular play. And this is the thing that I discovered that I believe is unique. I don't think anybody else has done this. And that is, I really began to see that so many of the plays are keyed to a particular sign and its zodiacal ruler. That opens up the meaning of the play because you begin to understand the philosophical and spiritual wisdom that Shakespeare has embodied in that symbolism and what he's trying to convey through the play. For instance, I just actually saw a performance of Midsummer Night's Dream at the Globe Theatre this afternoon, and the opening lines are given by Theseus and Hippolyta. Theseus has just basically overcome Hippolyta. He's defeated her in war, and now he's going to marry her, and they come in, but they're talking about their wedding. And his lines are, all about the new moon. Now, fair Hippolyta, our nuptial hour draws on apace. 4 happy days bring in another moon. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. She lingers my desires like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue. Well, what that really means is, and Shakespeare's audience would have known this too, you never get married on an old moon. You don't get married on a waning moon. And because they didn't really have telescopes at the time that Shakespeare was writing, the rural traditions had always been that the new moon was the time when you first actually saw just the sliver of the new moon. Now, we actually had a new moon last weekend on June. What was it? I think it was the 3rd. And so you wouldn't have seen the moon at all because the moon is in the dark. But by 3 or 4 days after that, you would start to see just a little sliver of the moon. And then, of course, 7 days after the new moon, you'll see half of it. 2 weeks later, you'll see the full moon. Another week after that, you'll see the waning quarter moon. And then there'll be a new moon, and the moon goes into invisibility. So you'd never start a wedding. You wouldn't have a wedding at the time of the old moon when it was a waning moon. And Hippolyta knows that, and so she says, 4 days will quickly steep themselves in night, 4 nights will quickly dream away the time, and then the moon, like to a silver bow, new bent in heaven, shall behold the night of our solemnities. Now, if you listen really carefully to the play, if you see it performed, or if you're reading it, notice that every time a new set of characters comes in, they talk about the moon. Aegeus comes in, he's complaining about his daughter doesn't love the man he wants her to marry, and he says, Lysander has wooed her by feigning moonlight. In other words, you can't trust moonlight. Then the next set of characters comes in, and it's the working men of Athens who are going to be presumably performing a play about Pyramus of Thisbe for the Duke and his new bride at the wedding. And they talk about the moon. Will there be moonlight the night that we perform our play? Find out moonshine, get out the almanac. The first time the fairies appear and Oberon and Titania confront each other, and they're, of course, having a conflict over this little child, the first thing that Oberon says to Titania is, ill met by moonlight, proud Titania. Now, this is not just decorative. This shows you that the entire play is really set kind of in the key of moon symbolism. And this would have been important because the moon was the preeminent symbol of change and impermanence. And that's exactly what you get in the course of the play. You get this hysterically funny middle part of the play where all the lovers are changing who they love at a moment's notice. Now, mind you, it's presumably because Puck is putting the juice of this particular flower into the eyes of the lovers. And of course, there's this really particularly funny part where Demetrius leaps up after having this juice put in his eyes and immediately switches his allegiance, his love, from Hermia to Helena. And then he tries to argue that it's reason that made him do it. And I think what Shakespeare's really doing is making fun of our belief that we think we're really in charge of our emotions when most of our actions are driven by our emotions. There's a number of different changes in the play that show you that, in fact, this was the ancient classical belief about the moon and about life under the moon or under the moon's sphere, that because it was constantly changing, it would be best to have a very, I'm going to say, wise, almost stoic attitude to these changes and take a little step back and then observe what's going on, take charge of your emotions, and realize that this is something that is characteristic of human life and you shouldn't be quite so attached to all of this. And you know, the Buddhists say that this is a realm of suffering. That's some of the ways that the first Buddhist truth is translated. But what that really means is this is a realm of change. And if you get attached to any one thing, because everything keeps changing, you will be unhappy if you keep trying to have things the way they were. And so Shakespeare shows us over and over again in this play, in a sense, how silly it is to be attached to things because you know that they're going to change. Now, the wonderful thing that he does in this play is he manages to get everybody matched up correctly at the end. So we have 3 wonderful weddings at the very end of the play. And it's at night. All of the action of the play takes place at night. Of course, it would have to be night or everybody wouldn't be talking about moonlight all the time. But it's a little strange because Theseus and Hippolyta talk about it's the time of a coming new moon. But the rude mechanicals talk about the fact that, yes, there's going to be full moonshine. We can see ourselves when we perform this play in the forest. And so you begin to realize that Shakespeare's playing with our kind of perception of determination around time. So you begin to realize that there's nothing that you can assume is fixed in this play, not even the time of the setting. There's more to it, but I will leave you to read whatever else I have to say in here. And if you're interested, I can say a little more later. Ask me about it. Whoops. Every time I hold my book up, I manage to cover up something that I'm not supposed to cover up. So I have to get used to showing this so that you can read the title. In this book, I've drawn on 6 of Shakespeare's most, I would say, best known, maybe most recognized plays. Midsummer Night's Dream is the first one that's keyed to the moon. But then I cover Romeo and Juliet. I cover The Merchant of Venice. I cover Macbeth. I cover The Tempest. And I cover King Lear. And the reason that I do in that order is that each of those plays is keyed to the planets in their Ptolemaic order as we see them viewed from an Earth perspective. Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Now, of course, what Shakespeare leaves out is the sun. There's not any one particular play that is just keyed to the sun. I suppose you could say all the history plays are keyed to the sun because they're all about leadership and about kingship and who is suited for the kingship, who is most like the king, who discharges his duties most like a king. Now, there's more to the importance of the sun because the sun is really kind of at the center of the system. And the sun is, we know the sun, everything revolves around the sun, but they still believed that the sun was kind of the center of the system. In the worldview of Shakespeare's time, it was extremely important that you maintain kind of the order of the system. And you'll see a lot in Shakespeare's plays where individuals attempt to disrupt the order is where disaster comes. It's disastrous for nature, it's disastrous for the human realm, and it's disastrous for the political realm. So in Macbeth, for instance, almost the moment after Duncan is killed, the 2 lords come in the next morning and they talk about how Duncan's forces have eaten each other. And they talk about how there's been almost like an eclipse and it should be daytime, but it isn't, it's still night. In other words, all of nature becomes disrupted because there has been an inappropriate attempt from one level of the hierarchy to move to the next level of the hierarchy. You know, Macbeth might have been acclaimed as king because after all, he saves the country from both internal civil war and external attack. But of course, Duncan kind of, you wonder why he did this. Right after the battle, he names his son as the heir to the throne. And at the time in Scotland,
when your kid is hurting and there's
That guy was real sad.
When your boy's got herpetogonosyphilis, it's real tough. We didn't know Jimmy had AIDS till he came home from school one day.
I thought that was the ad playing.
Doctor said it was the worst AIDS he'd ever seen.
from father to son, it was by acclaim. So this is a little odd, and I think that's part of what spurs Macbeth to illegitimately take power and suffer the consequences. So there's a moral dimension that's woven into the symbolism. We can see, in a sense, what Shakespeare's recommending is the right way to do things, the wrong way to do things. Often the heroes will get in trouble because there's a crucial point at which they reject love. Hamlet gets into trouble because there's a crucial moment when he rejects Ophelia. And once he's cut himself off from love in his life, he's basically set adrift. Now, Hamlet's a very interesting character type because he is a classic tragic melancholic, for those of you who know anything about melancholia, which is the second of the types I mentioned, the choleric type, and I'll say something about the melancholic type. Both the ancients and through the medieval period and into the Renaissance, people were fascinated by the melancholy.
Hey, I love women, okay? I love when women are good at talking and have good things to say, okay?
And if Saturn is important in your birth chart, what she's saying right now about the melancholic type is probably important to you because Saturn rules melancholy. And she's talking about Hamlet, and she's completely correct on all this. This is good stuff, man.
Type. The melancholic type is key to Saturn in the sign Capricorn. And if you know anything about contemporary astrology, you'll know that Saturn is considered an extremely difficult planet, brings immense challenges, difficulties, delays, obstacles. things get in the way. But ultimately, you're supposed to get some sort of success if you persevere, or there is, I guess the best way to put it is there's some sort of payoff at the end, although it may not be exactly what you're hoping for. So Hamlet is a typical melancholic because all the details that he gives you when he comes on stage absolutely say to the Elizabethan audience, I'm a melancholic. He says, his mother asks him how he is. And his response is, "'Tis not alone my inky cloak," which means he's wearing black. And I'll bet you've never seen a production of Hamlet in which he was not wearing black the entire time. And probably most everybody else in the play was wearing black. And probably a whole lot of the background set were black. And a lot of things in the play take place at night, so it's definitely black. Mother, nor customary suits of solemn black, nor windy suspiration of forced breath. In other words, he's sighing quite a lot. Nor the fruitful river in the eye. He has tears over his father's death. Nor the dejected havior of the visage. He goes around looking very unhappy. Together with all forms, moods, shows of grief. And grief was the emotion that was particularly associated with Saturn that can denote me truly. So right away, the audience says, okay, we know he's melancholic, and melancholics were deep thinkers, quite profound thinkers. Unfortunately, to the point sometimes of disillusionment with life altogether, and sometimes to the point where they might even consider committing suicide. And that's, of course, what Hamlet has to think about. And he's, that great soliloquy, to be or not to be, is a classic melancholic's questioning of how is it worth it to even live? Why should I stay alive? The melancholic type probably in our day would be correlated to some extent with a bipolar type, because melancholics were also thought to be capable of incredible excitement, impulsive actions, maybe even kind of mania. And we see that when he kind of makes an impulsive mistake and kills Polonius behind the tapestry and thinking that it's the king. So melancholics being an earth sign, a Capricorn is an earth sign, Saturn's associated with an earth sign, were somewhat disinclined to take action. And of course, that's the thing everybody always talks about in terms of Hamlet is, why doesn't he just go out and kill the king for heaven's sake, get it over with? But there's a really wonderful critic, and I would recommend this book. It's John Vivian, and some of his books have been reprinted recently. And one of them, he has a very fascinating argument, because every critic I've read always gets caught up in this business about why doesn't Hamlet just go kill Claudius and get it over with? And what John Vivian says is Hamlet is caught at a point in the culture where he wants to get away from the old revenge type of tragedy where it was blood for blood. Somebody kills somebody in your family, and that means you have to go kill that person. And then, of course, it starts a whole cycle that goes down through the generations. Hamlet doesn't want to do that. There's something in Hamlet that wants to stop this blood revenge kind of thing going on.
Well, why don't you just go and get the fuck out and never come back? How about that? All right, Kat. Bye-bye. See ya. Don't come back. Yeah, these ads, this is getting ridiculous. Yeah, okay. Shut up.
And that's part of the reason why he hesitates. It isn't just that he can't take a move, he can't have an action and go do what he's supposed to be charged to do by the ghost of his father. So knowing something about melancholia and knowing something about Saturn really illuminates that play. The most Saturnian play of all, I actually think, is King Lear. And that's because Lear ends up being stripped of absolutely everything. He gives away his throne, basically. He gives his lands to two of his daughters. He gets rid of one daughter. He ends up being upset because the daughters deprive him of all of his retinue. And so he ends up going out into the storm. And at one point, he even takes his clothes off practically. So he now has no home, no family, no friends, and he's out in this terrible storm. That's the most dramatic depiction of Saturn stripping away that you'll see in any play ever, I think. All right. Okay, so knowing something about Shakespeare's use of astrological symbolism illuminates the plays in ways that we, I think, have not thought of before. And not only does it illuminate the plays, but it also makes us think very much about the sources of creativity. People always talk about Shakespeare as one of the great creative geniuses. And yes, there had to be a consciousness that created these plays that was an astute observer of human nature, was extremely well educated and well versed in classical literature and philosophy, knew languages because a lot of the stories were untranslated and came out of French or Italian sources, but also knew something about the rich Western philosophical and esoteric tradition and chose to use astrological symbolism to convey his ideas. But he did it in such a way that they are, in a funny way, garmented, which is why I say in the title of my book, these are hidden keys. They're hidden to us now. I think they would have been clearer, especially to the educated of Shakespeare's time. But I think some of what he's doing in the plays is intentionally garmented because it's more powerful when it's received subliminally into our consciousnesses as we watch the plays. So I hope that you're intrigued enough by what I've said about the hidden keys to understanding Shakespeare's plays that you will be interested to pursue this. Do you have any questions, comments? Like 7 planets. Jake Weiss talks about the 7 ages of man. We have 7 chakras in the body system. And if you know anything about Eastern, well, it's, I think, more Eastern religion and philosophy that talks about the chakra system, although it's much better known here in the West. You know, those chakras are correlated also with the planets. And the idea is, and this may be in Caroline Mace's work, I'm not that familiar with her work, but I've been told that it's got something to do with that, that there is an awakening of the chakras as you deal with those particular energies. So it is like a series of initiations. And I really wonder, because I do view Shakespeare as a transmitter of the Western esoteric tradition, the Western wisdom tradition. I wonder whether there are specific spiritual lessons that are embodied in each of these planetary archetypes and into the particular plays that are keyed to them. Now, if you would like to pursue the alchemical part of it, in the appendix in my book, I talk about how King Lear may be an alchemical allegory. And the person who did the book on that, if you're interested, is Charles Nicholl. And he did a book called The Chemical Theater. And half of that is an explanation of what alchemy really was, alchemical symbolism, alchemical tradition, something about alchemy historically. And then he looks at King Lear and he interprets it as an alchemical allegory very convincingly. So I've included a little bit in there because the 3 particular esoteric studies that constitute the Western wisdom tradition are astrology, magic, and alchemy. And alchemy comes directly out of astrology because the metals are correlated with the planets. This is the wonderful thing about astrological symbolism is it is, actually a friend of mine in Toronto says, astrology is the most magnificent, gigantic filing system. It's like a filing cabinet because absolutely everything is associated with everything else.
Yep. That's Giordano Bruno. I don't know if he said something, but he knew something. Knew that astrology was like the best filing cabinet system of association, right? And Giordano Bruno used that to unlock memory, right? And what you could use memory, what you could do with your memory, right? How much you could cram in there, mnemonic devices and things like that. But astrology was another key aid in kind of remembering things better too. And by associating things with other things, you make the leaps from certain ideas to other ideas a lot easier, right? More connected.
Yeah, like she mentioned, the eternal, unchanging archetypes. They all go back to astrology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think I used the word holistic earlier, because this perspective on the world, the astrological perspective that was actually included in a much larger religio-philosophical system or a model, let's say, about the world, is one that is connected. If it had a particular keyword to it, it would be interconnectedness. Everything is connected to everything else. And that, I think, is part of the appeal of the system, because I think there is an intuition in all of us that really everything really is connected. We're seeing that in terms of ecology and the environmental movement these days. I certainly wonder whether the mechanist materialist perspective has, hit a dead end. It's come to a brick wall partly because of the damage that's being done to the environment, because of the impact on human beings as a result of it. And I think that makes this worldview worthy of reconsideration, that there must be some holistic worldview, and the practical demonstration of the interconnectedness is through astrological symbolism. Does that make sense? Yeah. Shakespeare got his knowledge of astrology.
He destroyed Adolf Hitler. Whenever
Boo. Boo.
$4,000 question. Because what you have to try to figure out is, see, there's three levels of society that I think we have to look at here. And one is, even the groundlings knew something about astrology, because even if they were illiterate, they probably were familiar with rural traditions about planting and farming by lunar cycles. They would certainly have known something about medical tradition, because all the medical diagnosis was done according to whatever temperament type you were, and that was correlated with the planets. And then they have a middle class, and the middle class is buying almanacs. One of the really significant things is just the century before Shakespeare is the bringing of the printing press to Europe. And the first things that would get printed, okay, so they printed the Bible, but there were actually more almanacs printed than there were copies of the Bible. And people did almanacs every single year. And the almanacs would tell you, what specific astrological configurations were coming up for the year, would tell you something about the eclipses. And the writers would often make prognostications about what was coming for the rest of the year. So some of that vocabulary for people who were literate, they would have gotten that through the almanacs. And then I think there's a very educated group, and they're probably reading more philosophical kinds of information. Another really key thing that happened about 100 years before Shakespeare is that Italian Renaissance happened, sparked to some extent by translations of Plato and the Hermetic texts by a brilliant, extremely interesting figure named Marsilio Ficino. And Ficino was a lucky man. He was sponsored and mentored by Cosimo de' Medici. And in fact, Cosimo de' Medici gave him a villa to work in. I'm waiting for somebody to give me a villa to work in. And he was hired to do the translations because Cosimo wanted to start up Platonic Academy in Florence. And I think Ficino picked 1484 to publish his complete translations of Plato because that was a year of a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And Ficino was a doctor. His father had been a physician to Cosimo de' Medici, and that's how he met him. He was also a philosopher. He was also a priest. He was also a translator. An incredibly interesting man who kind of danced a little bit in between the church and the pagan perspective. He taught Botticelli. A lot of the paintings that came out of the Italian Renaissance have implicit symbolism that's related to Platonic and pagan philosophy in them. So now these were published in Latin, and they eventually circulated through Europe and into England. And don't forget, a lot of the British nobles are making these grand tours to Europe, and sometimes as long as a year. I think Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, spent at least a year abroad and months and months and months in Italy. So anybody who's going to Europe is going to bring back knowledge of those texts. So the very educated noble circles are going to be familiar with some of these ideas. I've heard it suggested that Shakespeare, the Glover's son, might have learned astrology from a guy named Simon Forman. Although Simon Forman is really a dodgy character, let's put it that way, a dodgy character. And I think the level of sophistication, the philosophical wisdom suggests to me that he had to have learned astrology from somebody other than a character like Simon Forman. But you know what? We have no idea. There's not a shred, nothing in Shakespeare's handwriting. He didn't leave a book. He didn't leave a manuscript. He left nothing behind for us to try to determine what some of the... Is it possible he knew John Dee? Yes. In fact, that would be a very good guess, because John Dee had one of the finest libraries in England. Dee was a compulsive book collector. He would have loved Watkins, because some of the books that he spent an enormous amount of money that were very hard to get are so available to us in editions that we can just go into a bookstore like this and buy. Dee taught Sir Philip Sidney and members of Sir Philip Sidney's family. And Sir Philip Sidney's sister, Mary Sidney, was deeply into alchemy. And there was probably a group of nobles who met on the sly and called themselves the School of Night. there's one reference in Shakespeare's plays to the school of night. And so we think that they were meeting on the sly because, this is a very difficult time in British history, because not that long before Shakespeare's time, Henry had broken with the Catholic Church and started the Anglican Church, but there was still a huge amount of conflict between the Catholics and the Anglicans, and the throne had flip-flopped between, Henry, who was Anglican, and then it went to his son, and then it went to Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Catholic, and then it went to Elizabeth, who chewed her fingernails practically to the quick because she was under such tension to try to hold the country together under a number of different onslaughts, some of them political, but some of them religious. Does that answer your question? How this started. I began back in about 2006. I decided I wanted my fellow astrologers to really enjoy Shakespeare, and I began to do seminars in Toronto on the plays. And then I would take groups to see the plays at Stratford in Ontario. There's a really wonderful theater company that specializes in Shakespeare. It does other things as well. It does musicals, it does plays, but really it does a lot of Shakespeare. And the first play that we went to see was Romeo and Juliet, and that's the one that tipped me off, because I began to look at it and I thought, why is there a character named Mercutio? Because Mercutio is so perfectly Mercury in action. He's a talker. He blathers and blathers and blathers. I mean, the Queen Mab speech is a lovely speech, but he goes on for lines and lines and lines. He's just kind of making it up imaginatively. And finally, Romeo says, "Peace, Mercutio, be still." And then Mercutio goes on for another few lines. And I thought, Mercury. And then I realized that the nurse was the female version of Mercury because she's another blabber. And in the earlier scene where she's with Lady Capulet and Juliet, when Lady Capulet is suggesting that it's time for Juliet to get married, the queen goes on, the nurse goes on and on and on about what it was like when Juliet was young and she was queen. And she makes the same vulgar joke that Mercutio makes later in the play. So I thought there are two versions of the same thing, a feminine version of Mercury and a masculine version of Mercury. And that's when I started to look at the whole play to see, in fact, if this was mercurial symbolism. So I had to make a choice. Was this a play that was keyed to Virgo, which is ruled by Mercury, or was it keyed to Gemini, which is also ruled by Mercury? Can you guess why I picked Gemini? Think of what's the symbol for Gemini? What does it look like? It's two pillars. And so we have a play with two names of the two lovers, which is not the case for many of the plays. It's the only time in Shakespeare we have two sets of parents, both of whom are there. We have polarities. Shakespeare uses the language that's called oxymorons, and Romeo talks about, heavy lightness and the sun and the moon, and he puts all the contraries together in his speech, and so does Juliet. And I began to see a pattern of polarities through the entire play. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is really a play about language. It's a play about communication. It's a play about miscommunication. Romeo would never have gone to the Capulet's ball if it hadn't been that a servant stops him in the street because he's illiterate. And he says, read this letter for me because I can't read it. And that's when they find out that there's a ball going on, and it's a masked ball. And they go to it. And that, of course, starts the whole sequence of events when Romeo and Juliet meet. Now, another really wonderful thing is, I don't know if you've noticed this, at the moment when Romeo and Juliet meet and they begin to speak to each other, their lines create a perfect sonnet. And in fact, they start to create a second perfect sonnet, and they're interrupted, which I think prefigures the fact that this beautiful meeting, not just of bodies, but of souls, it's a soul recognition that they really belong together, because they literally make beautiful poetry together. We talk about people who, create beautiful poetry together. They literally do that on stage. And if you hear the lines, you realize that they've just immediately fallen into a sympathetic rapport with each other. There's a number of other details. So once I got that, I thought, oh, I wonder if this is true of the other plays. A year later, I was having lunch with the only lawyer client who stuck with me. I've only had two clients who were lawyers in my entire career. And one of them was so terrified at somebody finding out that he'd come to see an astrologer that he never said a single word on the recording. And I never saw him again when he left. But the second lawyer is an entertainment lawyer. And entertainment lawyers are different people, a different type of person. This is a man used to working with artists, creating contracts for them, helping them find agents and publishers and so on. And I happened to be having lunch with him, and I said, this is what I'm doing, Aaron, and I'm taking these groups to see the plays. And out of the clear blue, he said to me, I think there's a book in that. And that's what started me on a journey to actually write a book and pull it all together. Now, it's one of those things, everybody says this, if I had known how long this would take and how much research had to go into this and how much expense and how much hard work and how much passion and dedication, it basically consumed my life for about 7 or 8 years. It's one of those things where you think, gee, if I'd known from the beginning, I wouldn't have done it. But the truth of the matter is, it was absolutely the perfect thing that came at the right time. And even my astrological transits were absolutely perfection with this particular project. Nobody ever seen this before. Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I think is the literary critics don't know astrology. That's probably the most important reason. The second reason is, astrology pretty much died out in Europe during 1700s, 1800s, started to come back maybe late 1800s with the Theosophical Society. And by the way, it was England that kept so much of the astrological tradition alive. It was kept alive by people who were doing almanacs and that sort of thing, but it did keep the tradition alive. And finally, I would say probably starting, I'm going to guess around the 1930s, 1940s, a little earlier than that, some of the classical scholars had begun to write about astrology, but they were quite dismissive of it. It was sort of like, how could those cultures have thought about using astrology? What were those Romans thinking of? What were those Greeks thinking of? What were those Hellenistic Alexandrians thinking of? But with the work of Dame Frances Yates, who was doing her work out of the Warburg Institute here, D.P. Walker, a number of other people since then, many scholars have now, and especially in the last, I would have said 50 years, but I think there's been even a bigger turning point the last 15 or 20 years, are now becoming much more sympathetic in their researches about the importance of astrology culturally and in some cases politically. Because all the Roman emperors had astrologers. The popes had astrologers. There was even a pope who was an astrologer. All the crowned heads of Europe had astrologers. They still do. They just don't let on. A story was told to me that this comes from, I don't really know, there was a prime minister in Canada named Pierre Trudeau, and his son is now the prime minister of Canada. There was a big deal made about that because they've never had a son of a previous prime minister become prime minister. Pierre Trudeau is a very, very smart man, very highly educated. And the story came from his chauffeur to a friend of mine who was an astrologer to me. And apparently when Pierre Trudeau went to Mexico for a meeting with the Mexican president said, would you like to have a meeting with my private astrologer? And Trudeau said, no, I do my own charts. Surprised all of us in a way, but it didn't surprise all of us. So, we know Princess Diana consulted astrologers. I'm sure that a whole lot of them are consulting astrologers. Or they want to find out about birth charts of the babies when the babies show up. What kind of future do we see for the children? So, but the scholars have changed their view as well. And maybe they'll be more sympathetic. And especially if people begin to realize how fundamental astrology is to Shakespeare's works, and he's so esteemed. I think what we might find out is that there is a really, I was going to say valid, but it's not just that it's valid. There's a profound significance of, maybe validity is the right word here, to the astrological worldview in the way that it sees how everything is connected. Anybody here read quantum physics lately? The quantum physicists have been finding out the same things the astrologers have been saying, like, once things are connected, they're connected forever. It's called entanglement. It's really interconnectedness, which is the same principle of astrology. Any other questions? Astrology is an archetypal language, which means it's valid, it's universal, it's valid at any time in history. Whatever contemporary psychological language is being used is going to be interpretable through the symbolism. So, I talked about the moon as being the key to A Midsummer Night's Dream. Well, what happens, the forest is the symbol of the unconscious. We would say that in the 20th and 21st centuries. And of course, when the lovers go into the forest, all of their civilized, kind of veneers get stripped away, and all the anger and the resentment and the tension that's kind of been there in the friendships, especially between the two women, really comes out. And it's brilliantly presented. If you've seen Julie Taymor's film, on Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you haven't, try to see it. It's absolutely wonderful. That's exactly what she has the young lovers do in the forest. They progressively take their clothes off until they're down to their undergarments. But it makes sense because it's right along with the text where you start to see all of the submerged resentments come up. Brilliantly done.
Dude, that was fire.
Hell yeah. Pretty good, right?
Yeah, that was incredible.
Yeah, she's great. There's a whole nother video that we can watch another time. I thought we might watch it tonight, but not enough time. We'll do another show. The other one's almost about her talking about Shakespeare and his like cosmology, like him potentially being like flat earth minded, or hearing about, the developments towards heliocentrism, but staying closer to geocentrism. But yeah.
That'd be very smart, I'd say.
Now, I wanted to comment a little bit on what some of the things she said. Just using Romeo and Juliet as an example, arguably his most famous play. And that's also arguably because it's the most thinly facaded or the most thinly disguised, right? Or the least, kind of the most least subtle, right? It's the most obvious. Mercutio, right? That one clue kind of reveals the whole model that they use. Here, let me go open the door. One sec.
Sure. Yeah, so Mercutio, Romeo and Juliet, guys, is very obvious. Like she was saying, Tybalt, Ty for tyranny for Mars, tyrant, Tybalt, tumultuous, all very martial words that are going on there with Tybalt. Did you want to go through the rest of the characters there, good doctor?
Yes. So
I've got a slideshow pulled up if you want that.
All right, let's do
Some
it.
biz.
Let's do it. So she talks about Mercutio and she talks about Tybalt. Well, Mercutio is very mercurial, like she said. He's very articulate, lots of limericks and he won't shut up, right? And then also just his eloquence, it's a little bit catty. He's kind of almost gossipy or teases, and the way this is it's giving the impression of androgyny. It's giving an impression of he talks and acts a little bit like a girl or kind of in between the genders, very articulate, lots of words, but there's clues that he's kind of a little bit effeminate, right? A little bit effeminate. Think about this, like big, brutal, masculine guys aren't, shooting ideas out like, very fast. Someone's masculine and kind of calm and, tough, or even they're not really quick firing like that, So when we're talking about Mercutio, he's also kind of hermaphroditic. He's kind of, Hermes is also Mercury. Being in between the genders is another Mercury theme. So he's in between the genders.
Oh,
And
someone commented earlier. They said Mercury has a snake spear. Good little play on words there.
So Mercutio's mercurial. So he's Mercury. Okay. Now Tybalt. Why Tybalt? What does that have to do with Mars? Well, using Old English or kind of Germanic gods, Mars is Tyr or Tyr, Tyr or two. Tyr 2. Okay. That's Tyr, like we say tyrant, tirade, tired, terrible, things like that. That is Tyr or 2. Tuesdays, Mars Day, Martes. So it's Tybalt, Mars. Now, I don't think she mentioned Benvolio. Benvolio is the Jupiterian one. Benvolio means benevolent. Okay, benevolent. Right. So Benvolio, he gives good advice. He's kind-hearted. He's not a pacifist, but he's more forgiving. He shows mercy, but he's also, he can be valorous. Okay, so Benvolio is Jupiter, where he's kind of fair, right? Or he's kind of a little bit more well-rounded, a little bit more fortunate. And he essentially, he doesn't meet the demise that Mercutio or Tybalt do, So Benvolio is benevolent. His influence is benevolent, but also what he represents is kind of, he is not disturbed the same way the other characters are throughout, the different events. So Benvolio, that's Jupiter. Anything else Jupiterian you see about Benvolio? Merlin?
No, just overall, just nice guy, nothing but a benevolent, just completely, fits the Jupiterian archetype 100%.
Yep. Jupiter kind of has like golden retriever energy a little bit, and if you look at not this Romeo and Juliet, but the Leonardo DiCaprio Romeo and Juliet, the Benvolio in that movie was very golden retriever.
Let's see if we can pull it up.
Yeah, that guy.
Yeah, this guy. Oh, dude.
Yeah, very super Jupiterian.
Yeah.
Super Jupiterian.
Big face.
A little bit oafish almost,
Too oafish for a real Jupiter, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah. But okay, so that's Benvolio. Now, who else do we have in there?
We've got Lord Montague next.
Well, Cap and Montague, Capulet and Montague are both kind of Capricornian or Saturnian. These are like the mafias or like the big businesses or the big families.
The authority.
They're institutions. Yeah. That's very Saturnian. But yeah.
He's even wearing a chain right there. Very Saturnian. He's dressed in black right there. Very Saturnian. Yeah. And Tybalt, wonderfully dressed in red. Like, looks very martial right there. That one's a great soundtrack, and Mercutio's very flamboyant. Interesting.
Yep. Hi, Gabby. Good point. Okay. Who else?
From Romeo and Juliet, that's it. I think next up we got our boy Hamlet.
Okay, yeah. Hamlet is Saturnine.
Completely.
Okay. Melancholic, revenge-filled, not letting things go, black, goth, you name it.
Yeah. It's great. The this is the famous to be or not to be speech. That's what Hamlet has in it. And it's about authenticity, because Hamlet, the whole play is about how much Hamlet loves his dad, and yet he can't bring himself to get his revenge. He can't bring himself, even though he knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is literally divinely ordained to get revenge on his father, he can't do it. Like we heard Priscilla Costello mention. Yeah, Branagh is a bit old for Hamlet here, but dude, the Kenneth Branagh Shakespeare films are the best Shakespeare films, dude. Kenneth Branagh is the Shakespearean goat of film. My maybe not so humble opinion. But dude, like his Othello, his Hamlet, so many others are so good. He's the best Iago, dude. I got that one up next. We'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah, you know, Hamlet, it's like to be or not to be is about being authentic.
He's like older. He's like older than his mom in this this movie.
He's like, Mom, I'm so emo, Mom. But he's like older than us, bro. Yeah.
He's like
it's very anachronistic, 100%. But yeah, it's a play of authenticity, you know. And look at that, like that just shows, like, talk about a melancholic Saturn, right? Like the whole nation is celebrating his mom's marriage to his uncle. It's all red and white and celebratory, and then there's Hamlet dressed in black, just refusing to be anything but Saturnine. So a complete adherence to the archetype with Hamlet, and absolutely the best Shakespeare play.
Yeah. All right, keep going on.
All right. After Hamlet, we got Horatio. He is the mercurial type in Hamlet. He is learned. He's the schoolboy. And again, this Horatio is way too old in this one too. But in the play Hamlet, Horatio is the schoolboy, and just completely fits the Mercury archetype. You know, when at the beginning of the play, right, there's a ghost haunting the castle, and these two guards like, hey, Mercutio, you're a really smart guy. How about you come here and you use your wits, all your fancy school learning, and tell us whether or not this ghost is legit. And Horatio's like, holy shit, this ghost is really legit. So, you know, and he totally fits that play. And then Hamlet has one of the best lines when he says, after he speaks to his father's ghost, and then Horatio and the boys come up and meet Hamlet in the woods. Hamlet says to Horatio, he says, Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophies. And that goes back to what Priscilla Costello was talking about, how like astrology has been maligned thanks to the Theosophical Society, as she mentioned, because they fucking suck. But like in modern, like thanks to science, the cult of scientism, really, right? The cult of scientism is why astrology has been so maligned today, because everyone's, oh, I'm too smart for the stars, man. I'm too smart. Don't you know that's just a gas giant? Don't you know that all those different lights in the sky, they're just like the sun? Even though that's not the case at all, right? But everyone's so smart that they, will completely negate the oldest, most holy of sciences, astrology. And just, it's so sad. Like, how she was talking about in that video, man, when she was just talking about the lunar phases and how, the moon's invisible at the new moon. It's a crescent right after the new moon. And then the half and the full and the waning. And it's like, everyone is so sanitized from the divinity of what the stars and the luminaries really are. It's weird. It's like, I shouldn't feel pity because I shouldn't feel like pride, you know what I mean, over like this kind of thing. But I really feel bad for people who are so astrologically illiterate that they don't get the majesty of it, like just looking at the moon, it's like the simplest of things are lost on most people, like we talk about Polaris and the Big Dipper and the connection between those things all the time. But it's like just those simple things are so lost on people who are not astrologically literate. I'll land it there. But yeah, Horatio is the mercurial type, and then Iago from Othello. Are you familiar? You want to talk about Iago at all? Or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not going to have time.
Oh, okay. We got to wrap it up.
Yeah, to finish all these, but maybe we'll do another Shakespeare episode. But yeah, guys, we both love Shakespeare. Like Merlin said, he's an English teacher. Okay, so like,
no, I'm not. The fuck?
Oh shit, might be. Never mind. He likes English. What type of teacher are you?
I'm not.
Oh shit. Okay, never mind. Whoops. All right, my bad. My bad. All right. Well, he likes Shakespeare. I like Shakespeare. Yeah, maybe we'll clip that last minute out. I don't know. But all right. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Thanks for watching that video with us. Shout out to Priscilla Costello, and go buy her book if you can get it. It's actually kind of hard to get a hold of. She's hard to get a hold of too, but the book is hard, on the harder side to get. But yeah, guys, Shakespeare and astrology. Hope you enjoyed. And what's next, Merlin?
Oh man, who knows? We could do some Kubrick films. We could pick a different, just general astrological topic to talk about. A lot of different directions. We've done the calendar stuff. Let me consult the doc, honestly. But yeah, guys, that book is hard to find. I checked Amazon as she was talking, and that book is not on Amazon. So good luck finding it. I'll have to look on eBay for it, I think.
Yeah, I think it's out of print, and I've heard someone was saying in the comments, my brother thinks it might be true that she might have passed away. Priscilla Costello, potentially. If so, RIP. If not, then we'll try and track her down. But no, this book is not in the bookstore right now. We did before, like a year ago.
Could do a Crowley episode. Could do an episode with Saturn Rooster, theoretically. One of these days. Pluto and the Underdog.
That's coming in.
Longo's favorites.
Yeah, February is the best time to
during
talk.
the exaltation of Pluto over in Pisces.
Yep.
Right on.
All right, guys. Everyone have a good night. Go subscribe to Merlin's YouTube channel, which is Wise Wizard Merlin with a Z. Wise Wizard Merlin. And go subscribe to my channel, Dr. Narco Longo. I'm going to hop off here. Everyone, have a good night.
Thanks for the stream, man. Have a good night, guys.
See ya.
Peace.
In